I'm Zoe May Penlington, an ontologist in the Samples, Phenotypes and Ontologies team led by Helen Parkinson at EMBL EPI. And today I want to talk to you about the control vocabulary for COVID-19, also known as COVoc, which is a COVID-19 ontology applied to literature triage. So I will take you through our objectives with COVoc, why it was created, the specific use cases. I'll also talk to you about how we developed COVoc, right from the data collection to the OBO alignment and the generation of our OWL file and the release pipeline. And finally, I'll talk to you a little bit about some frequently asked questions regarding COVoc, such as, is it a control vocabulary or an ontology? And finally, I will end with our future plans. So why did we create COVoc? The project came from a collaboration with Patrick and Deborah from the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics at an Elixir meeting where they talked about the vocabulary that they needed for literature triage and curation support. While they had a list of things that they required and had already collected a set of terms into their control vocabulary, they didn't know where to start with ontologizing. In the Samples, Phenotypes and Ontologies team at EMBL EPI, we were able to help with this due to our developed toolkit for creating application ontologies and our expert knowledge on creating ontologies. From this initial meeting, we decided that our objective was to develop a new ontology that was dedicated to COVID-19 and would consequently support both the curation and the literature triage for COVID-19 related material. This resulted in COVoc, the control vocabulary for COVID-19. An initial set of terms was collected by the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics team containing internal IDs, synonyms, and more, all of which were required to aid in their curation. The terms were separated by axis type into 9 separate groups that contained specific vocabulary for groups such as cell lines, clinical trials, diseases, organisms, and more, all of which were pertaining to COVID-19 and needed to support the triage of COVID-19 literature. To align the original term list with OBO, we used our available mapping tools like Zoomer, which is an automated mapping tool that relies on previously curated data sources in order to provide high-confidence mappings, and the Ontology Lookup Service, or OLS, to browse the existing ontologies. This meant that we could use the existing ontologies to provide structure to COVoc by importing the subclass relationships, and we could augment COVoc with terminological information from widely used OBO ontologies. Additionally, we were able to connect the results of the triage data directly to other useful resources, which is very relevant to many of the COVID-19 knowledge graphs that have been and continue to be built. This resulted in over 500 terms with over 1,500 synonyms and mappings to 20 ontologies, which we were then able to line up for imports. For those terms without an ideal mapping, we created terms in the ontology spaces where appropriate, or we created novel terms for the COVoc ontology using a unique COVoc identifier. The ontology sources that were cross-referenced and terms for external ontologies that were imported in all 9 axes can be seen here. It was important to reuse ontology terms from the established and expert ontologies in order to improve future interoperability and ensure we weren't reinventing the wheel. As said previously, importing from external ontologies helped to foster the ontology hierarchy by utilizing the subclass relationships already created in the domain ontologies. So, after manually curating an initial set of terms, we were left with a long list of different ontologies we wish to import from. In order to maximize our efficiency and allow the ontology to be maintained by our collaborators, we implemented a semi-automated pipeline using the Ontology Development Kit. The ODK allowed us to initialize a repository for COVoc following the OBO Foundry principles and ensures that the ontology pipeline would remain organized. It also allowed us the freedom to create a custom pipeline using robot commands, which could work directly from the set of terms. The pipeline downloads the initial set of terms from designated links, extracts the needed terms into individual import files from each source ontology, and then merges this with our core COVoc file in order to maintain important information for our collaborators, such as the internal IDs that they use and any additional synonyms that are of use. This is also alongside novel terms created in the COVoc namespace. This allows for our collaborators to maintain and edit the ontology in a very user-friendly way, with all information in one place and a few simple commands in order to go from a set of terms to an OWL import file to a COVoc OWL file. Obsoletions also take place via this pipeline with a dedicated template for implementing a consistent and proper obsolescence process. COVoc has been in development since early March 2020, when the need to create a literature triage tool was recognised by our collaborators at the SIB. Quickly, they developed a set of terms from a literature review, and by the end of March and early April, our collaboration began. We met to understand the needs and requirements for COVoc, and then assisted in the manual mapping of these initial terms to existing ontologies. By June, we provided our collaborators with a beta version in order to test with their text mining tools, where they were able to develop COVID Triage version 1 over the summer months. In August, we officially made the first public release of COVoc, which is currently available on OLS for browsing. COVoc's strength is the ability to be used in order to assist in identifying COVID-19 literature and entities from various sources, which include Medline, Europe PMC, COVID-19, and preprints. And consequently, it's able to support the public literature triage tool, COVID Triage. By using COVoc, our collaborators were able to show an improvement in the number of entities recognized in the literature triage, which you can see here. COVID Triage interface is currently using COVoc in order to make the curation of the literature much more straightforward. It highlights the relevant terms which can be found within COVoc. COVID Triage is an essential element of curation and is available through this interface or through an API. There has been some confusion over why COVoc is the controlled vocabulary of COVID-19 when it is in fact an ontology. This is due to a few historical reasons, namely that COVoc was originally just a pure controlled vocabulary which was organized into a spreadsheet and referred to as the controlled vocabulary for COVID-19, or COVoc. Our team at the EBI then proceeded to ontologize and align the original controlled vocabulary with wider OBO efforts and our own experimental factor ontology. Another frequent question we get is, why did we not use CIDO? As we've seen in our timeline, the development of COVoc began earlier this year in March 2020, which we believe is in tandem with the development of CIDO. When the CIDO paper was released in June of 2020, we'd already released the beta version of COVoc, which was now being used and tested in the COVID Triage tool. We anticipate that this duplication of COVID-related ontologies arose due to the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, which required rapid development of a solution. Now that both ontologies are established and released, we'd be very open to aligning our efforts in order to ensure future interoperability. One thing to note is that there is not a complete overlap between CIDO and COVoc, as the primary use case for COVoc is the literature triage and not the ontological representation like CIDO. Going forward, the plan with COVoc is to maintain the ontology through the existing pipeline, adding new terms and synonyms where required to further support the triage and curation. This will be done in collaboration with the SIB team. We also plan to improve the interoperability of COVoc, as previously stated, by aligning our efforts with others, such as CIDO, and growing the current list of cross-references to include more of the OBO Foundry. We also plan to continue to improve the consistency of the COVoc classification, taking into account the users and their needs. Now that COVoc has been used for a few months in COVID Triage, we'll be able to see and begin to see the areas that could benefit from improvement. If you're interested in COVoc, you can access and browse it using OLS, or you can have a look at our GitHub to see the pipeline, or if you'd like to explore how it's used by the COVID Triage tool, you can do so by clicking these links. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge all of the hard work done by many of the people in this collaboration, namely from the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics and their Literature Services team, and the team at EBI. Thank you for listening.